Welcome to this edition of the 5 Million Gold Caboose. All aboard! The 5 Million Gold Caboose, boys and girls. It's time to get cracking on with a bit of history via the aid of Pluto Press, the wonderful Pluto Press, I believe based in London, who I'd love to support and give more recognition to. And an American, I believe, American academic called William A. Pelz. William A. Pelz, who is director of the Institute of Working Class History in Chicago and a professor of history at Elgin Community College. So he's written about Karl Marx, capitalism, the European left, Wilhelm Liebknecht, the German social democratic movements. And I'm going to read an excerpt of A People's History of Modern Europe, one chapter, chapter 3, about what I think is about tools, how tools relates to all of this, in relation to a video by Hakim Bey, or an interview with Hakim Bey, the link of which I've left in the description. And before we get started with the reading, I would like to read the blurb, or part of the blurb, for this wonderful book. A People's History of Modern Europe sweeps away the tired platitudes of the privileged upon which our current understanding is based, and provides an opportunity to see history differently, away from the great man ideas of history. Rather than being mere onlookers of the actions of the great men who stride the historical stage, William A. Pelz shows how ordinary men and women are themselves the drivers of social change. So let's get on with it. Chapter 5, not chapter 3, chapter 5. Becoming an appendage to the machine, the revolution in production. The revolution in production, or the industrial revolution, the revolution in production, or the industrial revolution, is, as it is more commonly known, is typically presented as a dull series of inventions by a cast of male, mainly British geniuses. So we have a parade of names and inventions presented without substantial discussion of the human costs. James Hargreave invents the spinning jenny to allow an increased amount of cotton to be produced by the one worker. That's in 1764. James Watt creates the steam engine, 1769. Cartwright patents the power loom, 1785. The first steam-powered textile factory is established in Nottingham, England, 1790. And the list goes on. But what is more significant is that each new invention destroyed the traditional artisan trades, which could no longer compete with cheaper machine-made goods. In the typical version of history, these wonderful inventions may have caused some momentary discomfort as societies adjusted to the new systems, but they were part of the march of progress that made everyone's life better. This sounds like a dry run for later commercials that attempt to convince the viewer that world civilization has just changed because of a new type of cleaning product. Although these inventions and their creators are an important part of the story, they are far from the most important components. What caused this revolution, apart from the oft-mentioned geniuses, is left unanswered, as are the results. What this chapter will highlight is how the Industrial Revolution changed people's relationship to craftsmanship, time, community, and their own role in society as a whole. For one thing, people in the 21st century have grown up in a world shaped by industrial capitalism, meaning it is difficult for most people to imagine a different type of world. People have fundamentally produced goods in the same manner for thousands of years. That is, they made products by using human labour with perhaps the assistance of animal muscle or running water. Of course, there was from time to time this or that noteworthy innovation in agricultural production, crop rotation, new methods of irrigation, and so on. And no doubt the 18th century shoemaker created a different style of footwear than the cobbler of ancient Rome. Yet in all, the basics were the same. Products of nature were raised and then made into products by human beings, living labour. Thus, an early modern shoemaker would easily have recognised the technique of someone making footwear centuries before the birth of Christ or Muhammad. All of this changes with the rise of the machine. Tools would no longer serve people, but rather people would serve machines. One noted historian argues that industrialism is on the same level as the change to settled agriculture and the domestication of animals. He contains that the Industrial Revolution is one of those rare occasions in world history when the human species altered its framework of existence. The reference here William Pelz refers to is Peter N. Stearns. Also, there's a footnote. The Peter N. Stearns reference is The Industrial Revolution in World History, published in 1993. William A. Pelz also has a footnote about the term Industrial Revolution instead of revolution in production. There is some dispute as to when this term came into general use, that is, Industrial Revolution. While the expression was used very early on, some credit Friedrich Engels for popularizing the term in his 1845 book, The Condition of the Working Class in England. One way to look at this transformation of European society is that the products of human labour, dead labour, became as important as actual people, living labour. That is to say that the machines, dead labour, created by human labour were quickly overwhelming actual living human beings. As more and more improved machines were created, dead labour grew in importance at the expense of living labour. Put differently, the human became an appendage to the machine. Or the person was put in bondage within the industrial system. Whereas in pre-industrial Europe, individuals used tools to create things, under industrial capitalism, the machines used and still use people to make products. What did this mean to the average person? First, the revolution in production ultimately reinvented society by inventing lifespans and producing a greater quantity and variety of articles of consumption, even for the average person. Still, without in any way denigrating the uplifting cultural importance of shopping malls, one might still ask, what was the price? What was lost? If there's a sentence that sums up this wonderful book, it would be, what did this mean to the average person? Life in pre-industrial Europe was horrible in many ways. There was disease, hunger, poverty, oppression, ignorance, and the list could go on. It would be foolish to try and present the times before the machines as some type of golden age for the common folk. Still, there were things that made life bearable for most Europeans. Commoners, for example, had a high degree of autonomy in their daily lives. They had little political say in the affairs of their country, were exploited by the powerful, deluded by the church, and often lived in poverty. All the same, they were left alone on most days that did not include church attendance, tax payment, or war. Feudal lords had far more interesting things to occupy their time than checking up on their serfs regularly. Huge theme now is the existence of time pre- and post-industrialization. How does the actual meaning of time change for most people? This is not simply train stations come along and therefore clocks are required to keep a universal track and a dependable sort of measure on time. It's much more interesting than this. The ruling class saw no advantage in making a great effort to monitor the work habits of commoners. As long as the masses appeared appropriately subservient, followed the rules, and did as they were told, they were left alone on a day-to-day basis. A woman in a 17th century village might go for weeks or months without anyone other than relatives and neighbours seeing her go about her labours. Along with the loss of their independence, normal Europeans lost control of time itself. Before the establishment of industrial capitalism, people had mainly been subject to task work discipline. Like many college students today, they could do what they wanted, when they wanted, so long as a given task was completed by a certain date. Take the case of the shoemaker. A person comes and orders a pair of shoes on Monday. The customer and the artisan agree on a style, price, leather type, and that delivery will be on Friday. The shoemaker can set to work on the footwear the moment the customer leaves, or the new order may sit unattended till late on Thursday. The person who ordered the shoes cares nothing for any of that as long as the promised product is completed by the agreed upon time on Friday. When the shoe or boot factory comes into being, the competition will most likely drive the shoemaker out of business. It is run on quite different lines than the previous artisan producer. The shoe worker must appear at a certain hour and can neither take a break nor have a meal nor leave until the hour set by the factory management. If the owners want the factory run 16 hours a day with an hour for lunch, so be it. The factory owner is not purchasing the product of the worker's labour, but the labourer's time. The industrial system ushers in the age of time work discipline. It is astonishing to read of the drastically long working hours that the first industrial capitalists instated. It beggars belief that they could treat other human beings like this. They must not have seen them as the same species. They must not have had any idea of what it meant to be on the floor for 16 hours a day with no breaks. They saw their workers as simply tools to exercise as far as humanly possible. The ultimate aim was highest productivity. This was not an easy transition for either craft worker or peasant entering the new industrial world. Rather than being master of their own time and working conditions, the industrial worker was left at the mercy of the factory owners. The workers now had to work at the pace set by the machines. They were now under the constant supervision of overseers who badgered, threatened, and on occasion even hit workers who appeared to be falling behind in their services to the machines. Raised in or with family memories of a different world, these first generations of newly industrialized workers were forced into a situation they held to be inhumane. In 1806, a commission of the British Parliament looked into the state of working conditions. They found one worker who testified that it was extremely difficult to get accustomed to being under time work discipline. The workers hated having regular hours. They resented the fact that they could not go in and out as they pleased, and have what holidays they pleased, and go on just as they had been used to. It has been said that breaking in workers new to industrialism was difficult and often required physical force, whereas those accustomed to the factory system were much easier to manage. Not only did the common people of Europe lose control of their time, they no longer had any say over their working conditions. Whether a workshop or factory was cold or hot was a matter over which the workers had little influence or control. Many pre-industrial Europeans may have enjoyed singing while working, but the new industrial workers, or proletarians as they are sometimes called, would be told whether or not they could even talk with their colleagues during working hours. In fact, in some of the Quaker factories, singing was required of the workers, strangely enough, unless I'm mistaken. Before the turn to industry, peasants and craft workers sometimes drank beer or wine during the working day. Now, this liberty was in the hands of the bourgeois owner. On the other hand, the worker who rejected all drink on religious grounds might have the misfortune to be employed in a place where the owner decided to pay part of the wages in alcoholic beverages. Some mine owners, for example, believed that large amounts of rum or gin distributed at lunchtime would encourage more initiative on the part of the miners they hired. Many temperance movements sprung out of this fabric of working class history, which strikes us as rather strange. These movements to ban alcohol, to completely get people out of their addictions and to eradicate any form of alcoholic consumption. If you go to a town built by the industrialist Titus Salt, it's called Saltaire because it was built, of course, by Titus Salt, bearing his name, and it's by the River Aire in Yorkshire. You will find out quite quickly that historically there were no pubs there, and we all know how big the pub is in British culture in terms of how we interact and where we go after work. It's the site of discussion, of course. So it strikes us as strange, as modern onlookers to our history. How on earth? Why would they do that? It seems so short-sighted and unfair and infringing on civil liberties. This mix of wanting to provide work and also education and leisure for working classes while clamping down on the physical pleasure of alcohol. So why did they do it? Well, startling accounts of the slums of all across England at the time really open your eyes to how problematic alcohol was. It was largely seen as another opium of the masses by many industrialists. So it's quite understandable once you read some of the accounts of the slums, the decrepit nature of people's time, no time for pleasure. It was almost like the television, you could say, of the late 18th century, early 19th century. Alcohol was so rejected by so many movements in order to free up people. Of course, it's easy for us nowadays to be quite defensive about any kind of drug consumption and say it's our own personal liberty. But at the time, British people were waking up drinking gin. A few centuries before this, Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese queen, remarked that in the court of mid-1600s England, the court were drinking gin at breakfast. That's why tea becomes such a ritual in British culture, because it was really brought in by Catherine of Braganza. Tea existed in England before, but Catherine of Braganza brings in the rituals and brings it a part of court daily life. So, long story short, gin. Gin was a horrible presence in early industrial England. Moreover, the average person lost the protection that their skills had previously offered them. That is to say, the years of training that might have made it difficult to replace a skilled worker was eliminated as the machines required service by humans with relatively minimal training. With each new wave of technological advance, another group of people would find themselves as if naked before the capital as their old skills became irrelevant. The handloom worker was rendered unskilled by the power loom, just as later on bookkeepers or accountants who would add long columns of numbers have been rendered obsolete by computer software. In fact, taken as a whole, the Industrial Revolution destroyed old social relations and people's very way of existence. Although this certainly had positive aspects in breaking down centuries-old prejudices, it also eliminated centuries-old communities. As this happened, people felt more and more alienated from both their work and their fellow humans. When thinking about the impact of the Industrial Revolution, the historian certainly needs to examine data concerning wages, health, and living conditions. Still, there are many losses that are less likely to appear on the ledger sheets. As British historian Eric Hobsbawm reminds us, it is vital to remember that men do not live by bread alone. The singing of labour was sucked out of daily working life. Of course, some observers, like the economist Adam Smith, found the resulting developments of the Industrial Revolution as natural. The point is, however, the vast majority of workers at that moment in history did not. They felt the new industrial system was unnatural and even against the teachings of the Bible. Often the commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," it was used as an insult to the new capitalist overhead. To make sure they were free, the government, at the behest of the capitalists, ended any welfare measures or social safety net. According to a report of the Poor Law Commissioners, any social assistance was, quote, "a check to industry, a reward for improvident marriages, a stimulant to the population, and a stimulant to population, and a blind to its effects on wages, a national institution for discountenancing the industrious and honest, and for protecting the idle, the improvident, and the vicious, the destroyer of the bonds of family life, a system for preventing the accumulation of capital, for destroying that which exists, and for reducing the ratepayer to pauperism, and a premium for illegitimate children in the provision of aliment." James Meek writes really well of this in his recent book, Dreams of Leaving and Remaining, inverting the traditional Robin Hood myth of stealing from the rich to the poor, and instead seeing the Nigel Farages of contemporary Britain as the honest poor working their way up, and the idle poor being the kind of rich, the ones receiving, the ones who now need to have the money taken away from. And it was no different in Victorian England. In reply, many average people said this freedom was an illusion, as the economic power of the bourgeoisie, backed up by the political power of the supportive governments, enabled employers to keep workers properly paid and without any real power over their lives. As Adam Smith himself noted, workmen, and quote here, "Workmen desire to get as much, the masters to give as little as possible. It is not, however, difficult to see which of the two parties have the advantage in the dispute. The masters, being fewer in number, can combine much more easily, and neither government actions nor laws prevent this, while it prohibits those of the workmen. All the same, defenders of the system chirped on that industry almost immediately raised the common people to a higher standard of living. This line of thinking is widely debated and often disputed by historians. Without becoming too distracted by this seemingly endless debate, it is worthwhile to look at some facts about the generations caught up in the industrial juggernaut of the 19th century. Those who have focused exclusively on wages as indicative of an increased standard of living often overlook important nuances that other facts reveal. How could so many contemporary observers bemoan the housing that workers lived in if those same workers were making more in wages? Those who once lived in rural poverty amid fresh air, clean water, and within a village community were now pushed into polluted cities with inferior housing stock. This could be because even with rising wages, quote, rents rose substantially relative to other costs during the Industrial Revolution. Housing quality appears to have declined from 1760 to 1860. That end quote. So that quote is from Gregory Clark's Shelter from the Storm, Housing and the Industrial Revolution, 1550 to 1909. Most are at least somewhat familiar with the horrors associated with child labour during the early part of the industrialization process. Those children old and able enough to perform factory work were horribly exploited and brutally treated in many cases. Their young siblings were, if anything, more in harm's way. A working-class mother thrown into public employment by economic necessity often had no choice but to leave these infants without quality care. The young children were frequently rendered manageable by narcotic-laced patent medicines with such grand names as Atkins Patent Infant Preservative, Under such desperate circumstances, the infant mortality rate may have been close to 70%. Also think of the way we've medicalized natural behavior, pumping kids full of Ritalin for their supposed attention deficit disorders. When discussing living standards during the Industrial Revolution, defenders of the system are wont to point to the drunkenness of many workers. The argument made is that wages were not too low, but that the common people chose to drink rather than make better use of their income. The solution to the poverty of the masses in industrial society was, therefore, to convince workers not to waste their resources on drink. Thus, the temperance movement developed, intertwined with religion and a firm moralistic belief in the individual's responsibility to take care of themselves. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, preached, quote, "You see the wine when it sparkles in the cup, and are going to drink of it. I tell you there is poison in it, and therefore beg you to throw it away," end quote. This individualistic ethos flew in the face of centuries of community-oriented tradition. Of course, it is quite true that money spent on drink impacted negatively on living standards. Moreover, the taxes imposed on alcohol meant that drinking workers paid a greater part of their income to the state than non-drinkers. It may be fair to say drinking posed a threat to the well-being of much of the industrial working class. The question that needs to be asked is, why did workers often drink excessively? Nor was it just alcohol consumption that cut into the funds of the impoverished worker. A habit that was more morally acceptable but nonetheless had a high cost was the purchase of caffeinated drinks, that is, tea and coffee. The creation of a global market that took place before and continued during the period of industrialization targeted workers as consumers of tea or coffee. While arguably less problematic than gin or beer, tea and coffee became socially defined necessities and thereby another drain of proletarian resources. Over time, caffeine became the world's most popular drug. This is still true to today. This was no small matter when workers' already low wages limited the number of calories they could afford to consume. The lack of sufficient calorie intake often reduced physical productivity and also caused depressed, quote, learning skills, increasing diseases and absenteeism, inducing lethargy and low mental performance. During the early stages of industrialization, calorie consumption often declined and made the problem of poverty more acute, end quote. That quote is from Calorie Consumption in Industrializing Belgium. A detailed case study of Antwerp illustrates the decline in food consumption by the common people. Up until 1830, every resident ate an average of 40 to 50 kilograms of meat yearly. By the 1850s, this had dropped over 20% to barely 38 kilograms. It would be a mistake to assume these numbers meant that the good people of Antwerp were turning instead to the products of the sea for their dining pleasure. With regard to fish, per capita annual consumption fell from 8 kilograms early in the 19th century to 4.3 by the middle. In the same period, grain consumption also declined, albeit not as dramatically. The authors of this study conclude that this reduced consumption resulted in, quote, the absolute pauperization of large sectors of the Belgian population, and the explanation must be sought in the definite breakthrough of the capitalist mode of production, causing widespread social dislocation, end quote. Within factories, workers were subject to hitherto little-known ailments like silicosis, a disease that poisons and ultimately destroys the lymphatic system. This disease not only killed many miners, but also other workers exposed to the dangerous byproducts of industry. All the varied changes associated with the Industrial Revolution put immense strain on family life. There is evidence that suggests an increase in family violence. A study of northern France found that before industrialization, murder had largely been an anonymous affair. As the pressures of the industrial system mounted, so too did violence among family members. By the 1870s, fatal violence, quote, in intimate relationships increased to become the single most frequent type of murder, end quote. During the early period of industrialization, 1790 to 1850, the use of child labour increased greatly, and in many cases the work of children as young as 10 was essential for the growth of new industries. A particularly vulnerable demographic of children has often been overlooked by those historians examining the period through the lens of the family. That is, children without adult guardians would often find themselves thrown into factories at very young ages. As one such person, a Robert Collier, explained that when the local labour supply could not satisfy the demands of industry in Yorkshire, the industry owners scoured orphanages, quote, where children were to be found in swarms, and set them to work as apprentices who were kept until the girls were 18 and the boys 21. End quote. Beside the lack of available adult labour, children as labourers appealed to owners because they were cheap. In addition to room and board, such as these were, a young child would make perhaps 10 to 20% of an adult male's wage. One might ask, what would motivate these children, sometimes called white slaves, to be productive factory workers? Both violence and discipline were important factors, but it appears that hunger was the prime motivation. What frames a lot of my attitudes to religion and to reading history is the existence, the phenomenon of the Holocaust, as well as slavery. How on earth did humans do this to each other? How was it made possible? And we shouldn't forget the treatment of children in industrial Europe. These industrialists scoured, according to William Pelz, they scraped orphanages for child labour, paying them 10 to 20% of what they would pay adult males, beating them, not allowing them to go on breaks, not allowing them to go to the toilet, not allowing them to sing. I don't know how it's possible that this became a European phenomenon. It makes you ashamed to be human. The transfer of labour from kinship-based food production to the larger industrial society created a new need for family labour. After 1850, factories became more sophisticated and required workers with at least a minimum level of education. Now we are not talking about courses in philosophy. Education in basic maths and literacy was needed, and adjusting machines and reading instructions became more important. The change from a peasant society to an industrial wage labour one changed family structures and dynamics. Before, the family unit had been focused on food production, tasks to which children as young as 5 could make a contribution. In the new wage labour economy, and here we have a quote, the family's, quote, primary function was to socialise and educate labourers for an industrial labour market. What put a special burden on the family was the extension of childhood from age 5 or 6 to age 15 or 16. Whereas previously, children worked when they became old enough to do so. Now their parents found themselves supporting adolescents. While few would argue against education for children, the result of this shift for the family was enormous. The family was now given the added burden of providing for their offspring for as long as an additional decade. Kids were not allowed to work for their own families, therefore. Inside the family unit, they had to be sort of transported into factories to practical wage slavery. So that's end quote there. Start the new paragraph. Okay. Another way to approach this whirlwind of arguments and counter-arguments is to examine directly the physical condition of proletarianized Europeans. At least in Britain, the first industrial nation, it would appear that the common people were worse off, if physical stature is any indication. One study found that both rural and urban labourers became shorter after 1780, that is, once the Industrial Revolution had begun. The evidence indicates that, quote, urban Englishmen were over 1.5 inches shorter in 1802 than cohorts born in the late 1770s. As usual, end quote, sorry. As usual, if things were bad for men, they were worse for women. English women in this period saw their height fall even further than their male counterparts. This was not mere accident, but rather part of the increasing pressure placed on women by the emerging industrial wage labour system. Two scholars note the fall in heights of English women relative to men is consistent with the increasing gender inequality in intra-household food allocation, end quote. Aside from physical changes, the number of English females unable to read increased during the same period. One should be clear, industrialization was maybe the fundamental transformation within European society. The change from an agriculturally based society to one rooted in industrial production was certain to cause disruptions and extensive changes in community and family life, as well as in the situation of individuals. The question remaining is, what caused the Industrial Revolution to take place? This is really fascinating. It's really easy for Brits to put a claim for our inherent genius here. Now, I'm not doubting that we are, of course, ethnically the most superior race to ever appear on the earth. That is, of course, undisputed. But what jokes aside, what's really at heart of the Industrial Revolution here? There's a fantastic debate about this with the legendary Melvyn Bragg, who by no means is a supporter of workers, but at least introduces the topic in his program on Radio 4, In Our Time. I admire him very much. I don't share much of his politics, but I admire him for trying to make accessible academic or ideas that are usually restricted to universities. I will put this link in the description, and there is a rather ferocious debate in his program on the Industrial Revolution. And it's ferocious particularly because Melvyn Bragg wants to argue that, yes, the Brits were ingenious for doing what they did, for inventing the spinning jenny, the steam engine. There was something in the waters. Of course, we should celebrate the ingenuity. And one academic says it's not that we shouldn't celebrate the ingenuity, but we should see the environmental factors which aided Britain to become the world's first industrialized nation. So yes, there were intelligent men. It's nothing inherent in British people. And in fact, we should look to the kind of the soil or the environment of Britain that really aided this industrial process. And I believe the academic, and I don't know her name, but the academic points to coal. It's all to do with coal, the existence of coal widespread across England. I'm sure there are many other factors, but that one springs to mind. So the question remaining is, what caused the Industrial Revolution to take place? Although we find their statues littering the Western statues, I'm just going a bit mad there. Although we find their statues littering the Western world, we can set aside the typical and unsatisfying idea that industrialism was merely the result of the inspired genius of great men. I've been inspired with my own itch right now. I've got an itch. Fantastic. Okay. So we've got to set aside the typical and unsatisfying idea that industrialism was merely the result of the inspired genius of great men. Even if one were to grant that this or that individual had a good idea, the conditions must have been ripe for the idea to be realized. How many inventions have occurred in places that were not ready for it and were later sort of independently invented, and we only remember the sort of later inventor? How many? I can't remember any of those, but I'm sure it's happened before. The ancient slave state of Athens had its fair share of original thinkers, but they produced relatively few technological breakthroughs that could compare with the inventions of the 18th and 19th centuries. The other contributing factors, aside from the individual geniuses that allowed industrialization to take hold and fundamentally alter the way of life, was the convergence of the new wealth and new forms of handling this capital. One development that allowed Britain to become the first industrial nation was the shift from wood to coal as an energy source. In the 200 years preceding industrialization, beginning in 1560, there was an ever-increasing replacement of wood with coal. The latter is a great advance over the former as a fuel. Britain had an abundance of coal and a relative shortage of wood after many centuries of turning trees into charcoal. It can be argued that, quote, successive industry which acquired a coal base was free to expand to a degree previously impossible. Salt, pepper, glass, non-ferrous metals, brewing, brickmaking, and iron, to name only the most prominent, end quote. By way of contrast, Sweden's reluctance to replace wood with coal due to its abundant expanses of forests may explain why Sweden industrialized after Britain. Yet, this Scandinavian nation went from one of the very poorest places in Europe to one of the richest in the course of the 19th century. In Sweden, it was not abundant coal, although they did have tremendous wood resources, but a highly educated common people that made the difference. It was, one might say, not energy resources, but human capital that transformed Sweden into a successful industrial society. So, if Britain accumulated capital for industrialization by seizing the common land from the average citizen, profiting from the transatlantic slave trade, and exploiting coal deposits, Swedish capitalism exploited the fact that their version of Lutheranism had produced a largely literate population. Still, Sweden would never become the industrial world leader that Britain was, partly because the country lacked overseas colonies and their markets, that is, raw material, as well as the capital raised in Britain by its expropriation of domestic land and foreign bodies. But these factors alone are insufficient to explain the genesis of capital that made industry successful. The evidence suggests that in every case this wealth came from two sources: internal exploitation and overseas pillage. Internally, capital came from cannibalizing the wealth of dying feudalism. In Britain, church land was seized and sold by King Henry VIII. In Sweden, Lutheranism provided pretense for the confiscation of Roman Catholic Church property, while in France it was a popular revolution that seized church and feudal holdings. These massive seizures have two notable aspects. First, the tremendous shift of wealth and power from feudal institutions to people with money, be they merchants, bankers, or well-off peasants, changed all those areas that underwent this transition to industrialism. Pushing rural people off small self-sufficient farms and establishing large estates for raising sheep for the wool trade released a huge amount of labour from their traditional obligations, forcing them to look for other work. These people were suddenly and unexpectedly free from centuries of bondage, oppression, and exploitation. They were often, at least in the short run, out of a job. All of this made the new industrial enterprises more of a physical necessity rather than an attractive alternative. That is, the people may or may not have been happy with pre-industrial society, but it did not matter. They had to join the brave new world of industrial capitalism, regardless of their feelings about the matter. One of the cosmic jokes about this whole situation is not only was the situation worse for the working classes, but the ruling classes try to convince them that their newfound situation was one of choice and increased abundance. It is important to remember that the European common people were dispossessed, thus providing both capital and an abundant supply of landless and desperate potential workers. While the details are still being debated, the fact that peasants were forced from the land their families had farmed for centuries While the details are still being debated, the fact that peasants were forced from the land their families had farmed for centuries is not in dispute. Many of the dispossessed would doubtlessly have agreed with E.P. Thompson when he argued that the enclosure movement was a plain enough case of class robbery. Externally, capital would flow into Western Europe as a result of the conquest and colonization of the Americas. The gold and silver looted from the once mighty Native American empires of the Aztec and Inca flowed into Europe from the 16th century onwards. With weak bourgeois classes, Spain and Portugal saw their wealth fly off to more developed centres of trade like London, Amsterdam and Paris. Portugal and Spain didn't have strong middle classes. The cases of natural disasters in Spain and Portugal, particularly Portugal, made the country very, very vulnerable. But what Pelz highlights here is that the lack of a middle or bourgeois class means that wealth wasn't absorbed into society and then flew off to greater capitals of capital or greater centres of money flow, money exchange. This historic influx of precious metal would have, in and of itself, been insufficient to finance the revolution in production. The European powers did not, however, simply loot the Western Hemisphere and leave. They set up colonies that served as sources of raw material on the one hand and markets for finished goods on the other. There was, however, a significant obstacle to this model of exploitation. While the landmass conquered was extremely large, the amount of available labour was not. Enslaved natives and colonists from Europe were too few in number to take full advantage of the territory conquered. The European elites sought to solve this problem by importing Africans to the New World. At first, some of these Africans were free, but the transportation of these people quickly became the slave trade. As important as slavery was to the economic development of the Industrial Revolution, quote, it did not by itself cause the British Industrial Revolution, end quote. Nonetheless, it is hard to envision a way the Industrial Revolution could have developed without the slave trade. This is another argument for why current contemporary countries who relied on slave trade should pay reparations, because the very fact of their cultural and economic dominance today is thanks to the exploitation of enslaved peoples, or the enslavement of people in general. So I would say that again, it is hard to envision a way the Industrial Revolution could have developed without the slave trade. This is because both the capital for industrial growth, markets for industrial production, and raw materials for the new machines were bound up with slavery, where profit rates could reach 30%. Of course, some scholars have disputed this figure, but the larger and more significant fact is that the slave trade made European colonies successful. Regardless of what profit rate came from the slave trade, the key point is that the American colonies were built by and dependent on slave labor. Without the raw materials and markets the colonies provided, industrialism would have been hindered. It was the slave system that made exploitation of the New World such an economic success. The French government understood this when they gave a subsidy to French traders to provide African slave labour for their colonies. As one Nigerian scholar has concluded, quote, the expansion of the Atlantic system provided adequate opportunities for the launching of industrial capitalism in Britain from the late 18th century, thanks to the Atlantic slave trade and African slavery in the New World. As profitable as the slave trade and colonialism were, it would be wrong to think that industrial capitalism just lost myself, excuse me. It would be wrong to think that industrial capitalism was financed only from external plunder. It should be understood that this experience was in no way unique to Britain. In Sweden, the 19th century and industrial capitalism profoundly changed the common people's relation to the land. This is something picked up on by Hakim Bey in the YouTube video that I've provided in the description, somewhere towards the beginning, around the first third of the video. As agrarian capitalism grew, the Swedish people saw two important changes. Quote, the creation of large farms and the emergence of a new landless working class. End quote. It is also important to remember that most advances in industrialization were due to, quote, helpful government intervention, end quote. As a recent detailed study of the rise of industrial capitalism found, the fact that artisan-led resistance to the conversion of British manufacturing to capitalism was only overcome through the direct application of state power demonstrates that the state played a very active and central role in the Industrial Revolution. The whole irony of present-day capitalism, especially in America, is that Windows, Apple, and so on, Hewlett-Packard, are heavily state subsidized. We have capitalism for local, normal, ordinary people, and we have socialism for the few, socialism for the drivers of capital. The common person did not just accept all these changes without a murmur of dissent. Some fled across the Atlantic to where the promise, if not always the reality, of cheap land seemed to offer an alternative to being crushed by the ever-growing industrial machine. Some protested against the very idea of mechanization and hoped they could hold back technological change. To cite only one example from France, in the decade after the fall of Napoleon, hundreds of workers gathered in front of the mayor of Vienne, shouting, "Down with the shearing machine! Down with the machines!" Further, it is vital to point out that, all often repeated libels to the contrary, there was no connection between protest or even collective violence and crime and criminals. To show another more significant example of resistance, it is useful to look at the revolt of the Silesian weavers. These workers had been relatively well off and had a fair amount of control over their lives because of the protection afforded by their skill. With the introduction of machinery, the weaver's skill was rendered unimportant. This rapidly drove those in the trade into poverty. In 1844, with their wages posed to dip below subsistence, masses of weavers in Silesia rose up, broke into factories, and destroyed the equipment. At first glance, this would appear to be a mere repeat, albeit on a larger scale, of the so-called Luddite protests that had already seen machine breaking in Britain and France. Karl Marx noted a major difference between the protests in an article appearing on August 10, 1844, in which he pointed out that this time, quote, not only were machines destroyed, those competitors of the workers, but also account books, the titles of ownership, and whereas all other movements had directed their attacks primarily at the visible enemy, namely the industrialists, the Silesian workers turned also against the hidden enemy, the Silesian workers turned against the hidden enemy, the bankers. End quote. This and other revolts have often been portrayed as mindless rebellion against technology and progress. The facts point in another direction. The weavers only decided to storm the mills after negotiation, mediation, and appeal had each failed. Also, in the short term, the tactic of collective bargaining by riot had indeed paid off in the case of the Silesian weavers' revolt. They were able to slow down the inevitable destruction of their craft. Of course, in the long run, they were doomed. Still, one should neither assume that mass action is merely the result of a mob, nor that mass action damages the interests of those resisting. And in the 19th century, there would be far more people resisting than just the weavers.